We now move about 375 miles, or about 600 kilometers, south of the city of Kahun to the environs of Thebes, site of the great temples of Amun-Ra, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, and the whole complex there. We're going to shift also about 400 years later than Kahun into the Egyptian New Kingdom, when Thebes was Egypt's capital. Now, this is the period most people are familiar with from ancient Egypt. It's the rule of pharaohs such as Tutankhamun and Ramses II and III. It's the height of Egyptian power, the period of its largest empire spreading into the ancient Near East and south into Nubia, modern-day Sudan. Like the city of Kahun, the city we're about to explore was preserved in the dry climate of the desert, having been abandoned after having fulfilled its purpose. This city is known as Set-Mot. That's the ancient Egyptian name, Set-Mot. It means the place of truth. I love these ancient Egyptian names. They're so ideological. They're like early American names like Columbia, things like that. So the place of truth is where we're going to be. It's generally known today by its modern Arabic place name, Deir el-Medina, which is what we're going to call it. It's a new kingdom city of about, 5,600 square meters. It originally contained about 70 houses, and it was eventually expanded to about 120 houses. It was founded about 1500 BC. Now we're across the Nile from Thebes, the location of modern-day Luxor and Karnak, and the city's inhabitants made their livings excavating, constructing, and decorating the numerous tomb complexes along the west bank of the river. Now, as mentioned, this is the period of ancient Egypt's greatest power and prosperity. And these skilled workers were, in good times, very well paid for their work. Let's look first at the city itself, and then about what we know about their lives. We know much about both the city and their lives from both the physical remains of the community, as well as large caches of papyrus records and ostraca. Now, ostraca are, large pieces of broken pottery or flakes of limestone, which were used in the ancient world as scrap paper. People would write on these because they were convenient and easy to have, and they would toss them out. And we have, dozens of papyri and ostraca that are found in and around the city by the excavators. Now, the New Kingdom city of Deir el-Medina was founded in the desert. As mentioned previously, the Egyptians didn't build on their own farmland, and it's quite literally surrounded by tombs. To the west are the rock-cut tombs that are cut into the cliffs that separate the fertile areas along the Nile from the high, broken desert beyond in the west. To the east, between the city and the Nile, are the great mortuary temple complexes of the New Kingdom pharaohs, all of whom were buried in the vicinity. So we've got the temples of Amun-Ra on the east bank, the great mortuary temples and tombs of the dead pharaohs on the west bank. And right in the middle of all that death on the west bank is Deir el-Medina. Very close to the town of Deir el-Medina were additional smaller temples to Amun-Ra, the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon, and also a later temple to the goddess Hathor. The placement of the village created a set of both temporary and permanent habitations. The city itself was abandoned after about 400 years, but the tombs of its former inhabitants remained in use. Some of the tombs are scattered along the slopes of the cliff to the west, and these belong to the skilled craftsmen of the city, while others were tombs, that is, the eternal houses of priests and overseers. So we have the temporary houses in Deir el-Medina and the eternal houses of the tombs of its former inhabitants. Deir el-Medina, like Kahun previously in the Middle Kingdom, is a settlement of skilled workers. And like Kahun as well, it had no public spaces or green space. I think today we might call it a bedroom community. People live here and they leave to work elsewhere. Now, Deir el-Medina was called by the people that worked there just simply the town, and that in ancient Egyptian is Padami. It's a community of highly skilled craftsmen, which included masons, painters, sculptors, draftsmen, coppersmiths, carpenters, potters, and basket makers. Really a tremendous range of every craft that's needed to construct and decorate the tombs on the West Bank. The community included all of these craftsmen, as well as their wives, children, and other dependents. It also had scribes, a police force, civil officers, a judge, a physician, and, my personal favorite, a scorpion charmer, about whom we'll learn more later. Now, a narrow street ran the length of the village, from the village entrance on the north to the south. Like most Egyptian architecture, the city is constructed in a rectangle with the entrance on one of the short sides and a long axis that runs down the middle. This main road, in fact the only road, may have been covered to provide shade. So we think that it's possible that there were porticos on either side so that you have this shaded road that runs down the middle. All of the houses open directly onto this road. So we have one main street and houses along both sides. These skilled and highly trained workmen at Deir el-Medina were better paid than most of the workers in Egypt. In addition, they further enhanced their income by using their free time, and they did have free time, to take personal commissions for furniture and grave goods. So they used their skills during the day to work on the tombs that they were assigned to, and in the evenings and in festival days and so on, to do personal work for other individuals. The workers were called the servants of the place of truth. That's their official name. And they're known collectively and informally as gangmen, divided into left side and right side gangs. This terminology was adopted from the division of sailors on ships into work gangs. Today we might call them the port and starboard watches that you divide the ship into, so left and right side gangs. Some scholars think that these gang names refer to the locations that these workers would work in the tombs. That is their assignment. That some worked on the left side of the tomb and some worked on the right side of the tomb. I still can't figure out how that would work. How you would have somebody who only worked on the left half of every tomb that they worked in. It doesn't seem to make sense to me. Here's what I think. I think these names refer to the side of the main road that each gang lived on. So as the road bisected the village almost in half, we have the left half, the left side workers, and the right side workers. So people, I think, are living in units based on their occupations, based on their assignments. Each gang, left or right side, worked under a foreman who assigned and supervised their work. And in addition, there's a scribe assigned to each gang to record pay, the work that was done, the costs, and to write reports up the very restrictive Egyptian bureaucracy. Those foremen and the scribes in each gang are the village leaders, and they would communicate needs and problems up the chain of bureaucracy to eventually the overseer of the treasury or to civil and military authorities. They're responsible for assigning and paying the workers, arranging for raw materials to be delivered, sitting in the local court along with the police chief, and witnessing oaths. So they're very important both in terms of the work, the civic government, and the social structure of the community. The scribes also supervise community servants, now these are free men, so they're not indentured servants or slaves. This is their job as servants for the community. Their job is to support the skilled craftsmen. They would carry wood and water, they would fish and garden, and they'd do other menial tasks, laundry, for example. What's particularly significant about these servants is that they give us indications of social mobility in the community, because some of them go on to be promoted to skilled workmen, so that the community structure allows for social mobility throughout. It's kind of, I think, a safety valve on the community. Well, thanks to the papyri and the ostraca, we know details of the lives of the inhabitants of Deir el-Medina. And these include their marriages, their divorces, inheritances, civil and criminal cases, all the things that you would document in a community, and the literature that they read, which we'll touch on in a bit. Also, for the first time ever in a city, we know a great deal about the women in the community. We know the roles they filled. In one occasion, the workman's wages were paid by a foreman's wife. We don't know what happened to the foreman, but his wife stepped in and took care of business for him. Other women participated in the rituals of the temples of Amun-Ra outside the village. They were priestesses or singers. There's a lot of singing in these ancient temples. They could also make bequests and inherit just as men did. And so legally, they have the same rights and responsibilities as men. And that's of interest, particularly for us in trying to figure out the social role of women in the ancient Egyptian world. At Deir el-Medina, we have that insight into their social equality, at least as far as legal cases go. There was also social mobility within the gangs, and the foremen of the gangs could be quite wealthy and powerful. We have the tomb of one of the foremen, Ka, who died about 1390 BC, or just over 100 years after the city was founded. And this gives us a great example of the social mobility as well as the status of these foremen. We have the sarcophagus and coffin of Ka's wife, Merit. They've been found in the tomb. She was buried with a lot of gold jewelry, along with objects of faience. That's that glassy substance that's fired over terracotta to give vessels the appearance of metal vessels. So a lot of objects of faience, wood, alabaster, bronze, and pottery. So a lot of the work of the specific crafts went into this one tomb. The tomb was also full of furniture, including wooden beds, stools, and boxes, and a wooden game board. Scribes could become wealthy as well. We have the evidence of one scribe named Ramos who served for 33 years. And at his death, he owned slaves and farms, multiple farms, and 3 tombs that he left upon his death, including one for his female dependents. Another scribe was twice accused of bribery and of exploiting the workmen for private work during their normal shifts. And this seems to have been a constant problem. The scribes or the foremen or overseers would assign the workmen to go and work on their houses or do work for them personally. One of these workers, a draftsman in one of the gangs, complained about a scribe, saying, quote, "If there's some beer, you do not look for me. But if there's work, you do look for me." I love those little details to give you a sense of what the lives were like. Well, that written material is critically important because it also allows us to trace individual families, which tell us about social structure, social organization, and social mobility. For example, we know of a foreman named Kaha. He was the son of a carpenter and the son-in-law of the foreman who preceded him. So, in other words, we have the son of a carpenter who marries the daughter of a foreman, and then probably through that marriage, he succeeds the foreman. Then Kaha and his descendants hold the post of foreman almost without interruption for the next not quite 300 years. So there's social mobility as well as social connections. I think it helps to marry the boss's daughter, something I always recommend to my students. We also know the details of a really interesting labor action under the pharaoh Ramses III. Now, Ramses III is pharaoh from about 1188 to 1156 BC, so during the later phases of Deir el-Medina. And this is a particularly interesting period because the gangs, both left and right side, seem to have had their pay withheld by the overseers, who, for no reason at all, were essentially embezzling it. They were just hanging on to it. Finally, both of the gangs gathered together and went on strike. They marched to the nearby royal temple, which was, as a temple, it was a regional administrative center and also a food distribution center. And there they appealed to the higher level administrators. And they conducted the first sit-in recorded in world history. And that is, they sat in on that temple and refused to move until their demands were met. They wanted to be paid. I think this is particularly significant because it gives us early evidence of something that's familiar to us from later times, and that is that people in cities with common interests can cooperate and organize to support those interests, a lesson that will, of course, be repeated throughout history. It's easier for workers, I think, to appeal and to work together when they're in cities. Well, urban life brings people into close proximity, of course, and naturally, conflicts arise. There was a village court here at Deir el-Medina known as the Kenbet, which had jurisdiction over all civil matters and minor criminal matters. Legal documents, such as wills and deeds, were filed with the court, while major cases were referred to higher courts across the river at Thebes. Civil cases concerning mainly failure to pay for goods or services seem to have been the most common. The accuser and the defendant argued their own case, his or her own case. There's extensive evidence of one resident of Deir el-Medina, a man named Mena, who seems to have either had a run of really problem agreements or just to have been litigious. In one case, he sued for payment owed on a pot of fat that he sold on credit. Mena had to make accusation at court 3 times before the scribe of the court, and finally 18 years later, a 4th time. At that point, after 18 years, the accused swore to pay for the pot of fat within a month, or to pay a fine of double the cost of the fat, and to accept 100 blows with a stick. Mena also filed other cases for non-payment for some clothing and to complain about a defective donkey he had been sold. Interestingly enough, I think it's interesting, the Court of Appeals for the local community court at Deir el-Medina was the person of the deified Amenhotep I. Amenhotep I was the pharaoh in about 1500 BC when Deir el-Medina was founded. He passed away and was deified. And so what you could do is you could appeal to Amenhotep I, and the priests would hear from him. Effectively, you would request an oracular verdict. And so the priest would tell you what Amenhotep I, the god, said about your case. And that was the Court of Appeals for the local court. The local court also dealt with cases of theft, and petty theft seems to have been fairly common. There's one particular case of a workman named Nebnufer. He's the son of Nakhi, and he filed suit accusing a local lady, Haria, of stealing one of his tools, which, because of its value, he had buried under the floor of his house. When questioned about the theft of the tool in court, she denied stealing it. So she was offered the chance to swear an oath of her innocence to the god Amun-Ra, the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon. And she immediately did so, which it turned out bad mistake. Because then the court ordered a search of her house. The tool was discovered along with ritual objects stolen from a local temple. Haria was therefore found guilty of blasphemy and perjury, as well as theft, and condemned to death. Well, the village, as we know about it from its physical remains, consisted almost entirely of housing for the workers and their families. The houses were on average about 750 square feet, about 70 square meters, with the same construction methods throughout the village as at Kahun from the Middle Kingdom. Stone foundations, supporting walls made of mud brick. The walls are plastered with mud and then whitewashed on the exteriors and on the interiors up to a height of about 1 meter. One imagines that the whitewashing is more to protect the mud brick than for any aesthetic purpose. The houses are designed in a way that I think is similar to American shotgun houses, and they differ from the small houses at Kahun in size, they're larger, and in design. Each has a narrow frontage along the street with an entrance and a series of rooms that proceeded back from that, one opening onto the next. This was normally about 4 or 5 rooms, including an entrance room, a main room, a kitchen, and 2 smaller rooms. Now notice I'm not giving you functions. I'm not calling these living rooms or dining rooms or whatever, because we don't really know, and in fact we think that there's a lot of multiple functions going on in these spaces. These 2 smaller rooms, for example, may have served as storerooms for commodities, work areas, or as separate quarters for the women in the household, although that conclusion is highly debated by scholars. Some think that the women in the household were excluded in these small rooms in the back, but again, that's something scholars debate. Each house had 1 or 2 stone or brick cellars for storage and a staircase leading to a flat roof. Again, that flat roof, like at Calhoun, was probably used as additional living space for laundry or whatnot, perhaps to sleep in hot nights. The main room, interestingly enough, contained a mud brick platform, which was plastered and whitewashed, and was almost perfectly paralleled by the same structure seen in the houses at Çatalhöyük from about 7400 BC. It may have served as a bed platform and seating area. Nearly all of the main rooms of the houses, however, contained shrines consisting of small altars and wall niches for small-scale statues, perhaps of deities, perhaps of the pharaoh. So what this tells us, or what we believe this tells us, is that the mud brick platform may have been used for some religious purpose instead of or in addition to its domestic one. It may have been a sleeping platform, and it may have been a religious space as well. Child burials have been found under the platforms in some of the main rooms. As at Çatalhöyük, Jericho, and Calhoun, these domestic burials of infants are thought to be evidence of home ownership by the family who lived here and proclaimed this as family space, because you bury infants within the walls of the household, and the house stands for the household of the extended family. Well, the written records from Deir el-Medina also provide details of the medical care of the community. People get sick. People have always gotten sick. But people who perform manual labor also get injured, especially in this period before safety equipment or worker protection legislation. And when they get sick or injured, they need care. At Deir el-Medina, there are two choices for professional care, if we can call it professional care. There's a part-time physician and a scorpion charmer. Now, the usual way of thinking about this, or of writing about this in the scholarly literature, is to think of the physician as medicine and the scorpion charmer as magic. I don't think that's correct. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I prefer to think about it, and I think this is far more accurate, to consider this division of labor between these medical practitioners as the physician being a general practitioner and the scorpion charmer being a specialist. Because each prescribed a variety of potions for illness and injury. The specialist, however, also included some spells and amulets along with the potions and unguents. The scorpion charmer was primarily employed, as you might have guessed, to aid against stings and bites. Now, scorpions are ubiquitous in the deserts of the Near East and Egypt. They hide under rocks and in cool places during the day, and at night they come out and actively try to enter homes. When I lived in Oklahoma, I remember on summer nights as it got cool, the houses would continue to radiate heat. And they were brick houses, as here at Deir el-Medina, and you'd open the front door and scorpions would scamper in over the threshold down in the hallway, trying to find that heat because they're cold-blooded animals. And so I've encountered this myself, both the scorpions coming in and the stings. When scorpions sting, it hurts. And I'm speaking here from personal experience. It's amazingly painful. I was stunned. Just to give you some example, I broke my arm one time and kind of didn't notice. I didn't pay attention to it for several hours afterwards. But when I got stung by a scorpion, I couldn't focus on anything else. The pain was just debilitating. And then sometimes it can be fatal. So the scorpion charmer is an important medical specialist here to provide protection against or treatment for the stings of these insects. In addition to that, with the papyri and ostraca that we have here tell us that the villagers apparently enjoyed stories. Now, we don't know what the literacy rate here is. We have a tremendous amount of literature, but we don't know if people are reading this personally or if it's being read to them. And I think that's a particularly interesting idea, that somebody is reading these accounts and sharing them with the community. I think about the cigar workers of the 19th and early 20th century who would work, laboring for hours in these cigar factories, hand-rolling cigars, and there would be a reader up at the front of the room who would read novels to them as they worked. And I wonder if something like that's occurring here, because I can't believe that all of these workers were literate. Perhaps what we have, in fact, in this store of stories is the villages stories that would be read to the workers as they worked. We don't know, but I think that's probably more likely than a lending library, for example. Well, many of the best preserved stories and poems that survive from ancient Egypt actually come from Deir el-Medina. These include comic works. The most common of these is the so-called satire of the trades. It's a scribe's negative description of other trades and comparing them, well, derisively, to scribes. That is, the shortcomings of all other trades compared to the greatness of scribes. There's also popular stories. There may be folk tales that are found, such as the tale of Sinuhe. This is the story of a refugee in the Middle East during the Middle Kingdom about 400 years earlier. There's also the allegorical tale of the blinding of truth by falsehood, which I imagine you can figure out the allegory there. Mythological stories are found, such as the adventures of Set and the struggles between Horus and Set. Set is the god of the desert, and he, according to Egyptian mythology, had killed Osiris, the father of Horus. And so Horus is battling against Set to avenge the death of his father and to show his own supremacy over Set and to support his claim to the rule of Egypt. Now, one work known from official accounts is the victory hymn of Ramses II, celebrating his victory over the Hittite Empire at the Great Battle of Kadesh. I have to tell you, historians believe that, in fact, this was not a victory, it was a draw, and both sides actually withdrew. But, according to Ramses II, this was a victory. This battle in modern-day Syria was fought on the border between the Hittite and Egyptian empires for control over the disputed area. And I think that it's quite likely that copies of this hymn were distributed to Egyptian communities, frankly, as propaganda by Ramses II. There's one genre of literature that would be familiar to us that's found really throughout the evidence from Deir el-Medina, and this is books of advice. The advice industry in ancient Egypt included books of pragmatic advice, mainly focused along the lines of getting along with others. And there's also advice on interpreting dreams. There's a couple of examples of this. If a man sees himself in a dream looking out of a window, good. It means the hearing of his cry by his God. Another one, if a man sees himself in a dream drinking a warm beer, bad. It means suffering will come upon him. Now, the workmen were paid mainly in food, but also in other commodities. The rations consisted chiefly of wheat and barley, as well as some vegetables, fish, and water. One important commodity was firewood as well. These were supplemented by less regular supplies of beer and dates, with extra rations on religious holidays. These bonuses on the holidays might include meat, salt, and oil, as well as just additional regular rations. Based on these commodities, workers developed their own internal economy of a form we recognize as private enterprise and consumerism. They bartered with each other for various goods and services, with scribes charging for recording these private transactions. One example from an ostrakhan shows how someone paid for a wooden coffin that had been commissioned. Some of the cost was met with copper, which was the basis of trade, but the rest with 2 goats, a pig, and 2 logs of wood. Many of the elements in the social structure of Deir el-Medina are familiar to us today. These include social mobility, family-based housing, craft specialization, and community leadership. In this last category, community leadership, we can include city government and law courts, both of which are preserved at this level, at the city level, for the first time ever in world history. Although Deir el-Medina was an unusual community, largely composed of skilled workmen and their families, and not a cross-section of Egyptian society, nevertheless, there are elements about it that date back thousands of years. The forms of the houses and the facts of infant burials would be familiar to the inhabitants of Kahun 400 years earlier and to the inhabitants of Jericho in the Neolithic, and to a lesser extent, the Harappan cities of the Indus Valley and Çatalhöyük from the early Neolithic. These ancient qualities of Egyptian society will be explored in the next city, where we see them turned upside down, the tremendous social upset that's found at the new Egyptian capital of Amarna.